A white lie whispered in comfort turned crimson with guilt. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Tell me your city. I value your voices. Wolfe begins the chase. It began with a lie so small it barely deserved the name. A white lie, as the phrase goes, though by the time it reached Nero Wolfe's desk, it had gathered enough dirt to turn grey at best. It was a Monday morning, one of those that makes even the city sound tired. I was at my usual post behind my desk in the office, half listening to Wolfe abuse the English language in muttered bursts while he dictated correspondence to orchid suppliers. He was in no mood for human interference. So naturally, the doorbell rang. Fritz went to answer it, and a few moments later he appeared in the doorway, looking as apologetic as a man can without saying a word. That expression usually meant trouble with capital letters. "A lady, Mr. Goodwin," he said. "She insists it's urgent." Wolfe looked up from his letters as though Fritz had announced an incoming plague. Confound it, Archie. Did I or did I not declare this morning inviolate? You did, I said. But the world's slow on the uptake. Want me to handle her? He frowned, tugged thoughtfully at an invisible thread on his vest. No. Show her in. If she insists on urgency, she must have miscalculated gravely. It will be my duty to correct her. The woman who entered didn't look like the kind who miscalculated anything. She was in her early 30s, neatly dressed in navy and white, her movements clipped and exact. She carried a small envelope in her hand, and the kind of self-control that makes you think she'd practiced it. Her eyes, grey and steady, went straight to Wolfe. "Mr. Wolfe, I'm afraid this isn't a social visit," she said. "My name is Vivian Kent. I need your help before something very foolish becomes something very dangerous." "Many things begin as foolish," Wolfe replied. "Only a few mature into danger. Sit down, Miss Kent. You may tell me what brand of folly we are facing." She sat on the edge of the red chair, not relaxed enough to use its backrest. "I lied," she said simply. "Once. To protect someone else. But now that lie has started moving on its own. Someone knows, and they're using it against me." I shot a glance at Wolfe, who didn't move. You could have replaced him with a bust of himself, and no one would have noticed. He steepled his fingers. "You are employed?" "Yes, by the Sterling Foundation. I'm their communications director." "Ah." Wolfe's tone suggested that explained both too much and nothing. "And your lie? Was it professional or personal?" Her lips tightened. "Both." That earned her a mild lift of Wolfe's brow, which, in his world, was like gasping aloud. "You propose that I, what? Salvage your reputation? Identify your blackmailer, or validate your virtue?" "Identify him," she said. "Someone left this at my office this morning." She passed me the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, typewritten, no signature. "You've built a career on sincerity, Miss Kent. Pity about the lie. The board would love to hear it, unless we come to an arrangement. Leave $10,000 in an unmarked envelope at the Botanical Conservatory, South Entrance, 6 p.m. Tuesday. No police." I handed it to Wolfe, who took it between two fingers like it was damp. He read it twice, then dropped it on his desk blotter. "And this lie, if revealed, would destroy your position?" "Yes, and someone else's." "Name?" "I can't." She hesitated, then added, "Not yet." That word, "yet," earned her Wolfe's full attention, which was something few mortals have survived comfortably. "Miss Kent," he said, his voice as soft as butter but colder. "You come into my house, interrupt my morning, and request my aid. But you propose to withhold material facts. What, then, am I to work with? Only that the person I lied for doesn't deserve what's happening. I'll pay your fee, of course." Wolfe gave her a long, unbroken stare. Then he closed his eyes, leaned back, and exhaled heavily through his nose. "Archie." "Yes, sir." See Miss Kent to the door." That startled her, and I'll admit, me a little. "Mr. Wolfe," she began, "if you just—" "No," he interrupted, eyes still closed. "You are attempting to bargain with half-truths. I do not haggle in ignorance. Good day." I escorted her to the hall. She stopped at the door, gave me a look part frustration, part appeal. "He doesn't understand," she said. "Oh, he understands," I told her. "That's the problem." She left without another word. I closed the door and came back to find Wolfe glaring at the envelope as if it had personally ruined his breakfast. "You're not taking it?" I asked. "I've taken nothing," he said. "A woman who tells me she lies and then withholds the truth. Pshaw! A paradox is not a client." "Maybe. But that note's real. Blackmail, money drop, the works." "Indeed. Then let her submit to the police." "She won't." "Then she will suffer the consequence of her discretion." I was halfway to my desk when the phone rang. I picked it up. After a few seconds, I said, "For you." Wolfe gestured irritably. "Who?" "Inspector Kramer." That got his eyes open. He took the receiver, listened a while, then said, "Send him here if you must." He hung up, sighed, and closed his eyes again. "Archie, it appears Miss Kent's folly has graduated." "How so?" He opened his eyes, the corners narrowing. "Kramer reports that a Mr. Julian Ebert, chairman of the Sterling Foundation Board, was found dead in his office an hour ago." Kramer arrived with the weather still on him. The doorbell hit twice in quick succession, which is how he says hello when he's short of patience, and Fritz led him in like a man escorting a bear that has promised not to maul the furniture. Kramer's hat looked like it had lost an argument with a lamppost, and the cigar behind his molars was chewing back. He halted 3 paces inside the office and sniffed the room, as if homicide leaves a scent and he meant to pin it on the rug. "Wolfe," he said, "tell me you don't have your paws in this." Wolfe did not open his eyes. "Archie, explain to Inspector Kramer the concept of privacy." "Sure, it's what we're not getting." I gave Kramer my most honest smile. "You sounded lively on the phone. You want tea?" "Fritz can." "I want answers," he said. "Julian Ebert is dead. Maybe heart. Maybe not. Autopsy will tell me whether I'm wasting my time or rounding up a murderer. He was found in his office at the Sterling Foundation on the floor behind his desk. Window cracked, door locked on the latch, secretary out to lunch, and this is where it gets interesting. His appointment book has the name V. Kent inked in at 11:30. That was an hour before my first phone call to you." Wolfe opened one eye, then the other, like a cat deciding whether to bother with a mouse. "This is the communications director. Miss Vivian Kent." Kramer's gaze flicked to me. "So you do know her. When did she bring her troubles to you?" Wolfe, damn him, left a gap big enough for a moving van. "Inspector, I have told you repeatedly, I'm not your stenographer. If you have questions, you may arrange for a subpoena and waste both our time. Or you may sit and use your brain." Kramer scowled at the red chair as if sitting in it would concede territory. He sat anyway. The chair creaked in protest and then gave up. "Fine, we'll do it the fun way. Ebert's widow is on her way to HQ. The Foundation's general counsel is already screaming about donors. I have witnesses who say Ebert was in a lather about a communication problem this morning, and your name pops up the minute I pull a thread. That's the part I hate most." "It does seem to be your least favorite sport," I said, "outside of losing wagers on the Yankees." He ignored me. "Wolfe, if Vivian Kent came here, I want to know what about, if there's a blackmail angle." That got both Wolfe's eyes to full mast. He swung to me. "Archie, in my drawer." I slid open the right-hand drawer and took out the envelope Vivian had left for us by way of invitation. Kramer's eyes narrowed at the sight of white paper. I passed him the note. He read it once. He didn't bother with twice. "$10,000 at the conservatory," he said. "No signature. Typewritten. Generic threat. He looked at Wolfe. "And you were going to call me when?" "I was not going to call you," Wolfe said. "Miss Kent was not my client. I was not persuaded she deserved my effort." "You never are," Kramer growled. "She's a person of interest now. She met with Ebert at 11:30. She left shortly after. At 1 o'clock, he's dead on the floor. Between those, she visits you to talk about blackmail. That's a neat triangle." "Triangles are for billiards," Wolfe said. "You'll discover the angles change when pushed." I said, "For what it's worth, she didn't give us details. Just the note and a plea." Wolfe tossed her out on her self-control. Kramer's jaw worked on the cigar. "She'll be at HQ within the hour. If she isn't, I'll have her fetched. In the meantime, this letter stays with me." Wolfe's lips compressed. "Of course, it's bait and I'm not angling." "You? Not angling?" Kramer stood, pocketing the note with a sour satisfaction. "If this is murder, I'll be camping on your stoop. If it's not, I'll be camping anyway for the pleasure." He stomped out, leaving a draft that made the curtains dance a step and stop. Embarrassed. Fritz reappeared, eyebrows inquisitive. I shook my head and he disappeared again, as if he'd only peeked to make sure the house still stood. Wolfe leaned back and let gravity do the thinking for him. His eyelids lowered. He let 2 minutes pass, which in that room counts as thunder. "Archie," he said without opening them, "get me what you can on the Sterling Foundation, the board, the executive officers, revenue, recent scandals. They're public projects, especially anything that crosses politics." "You're taking the case?" "I am preparing to have it thrust upon me." He sighed. "The woman's lie, if her lie was ever white, has drawn blood. That changes the balance." "Okay." I picked up the phone and started the routine. Lon Cohen for the clips and whispers, a quick pass through our directories, and 3 calls to people who think non-profit is a polite word for complicated. By the time I was done stacking notes, the pile had the shape of a respectable headache. The Sterling Foundation had its fingers in arts education, urban conservation, public health messaging, and anything else that looked noble at a gala. Money old enough to prefer silence and new enough to require applause. The board, Julian Ebert as chair, Miranda Cho, a high-speed accountant who could turn a ledger into a weapon, Dr. Amos Quill, a physician with a talent for microphones, Lyle Barlow, executive director and self-branded reformer, and a donor representative named Clarice Vane, widow by history, benefactor by hobby. Beneath them, the working crew, Vivian Kent in communications, Peter Lake in grants, and a facilities manager, Neil Nystrom, who'd been there longer than the paint. I read it off to Wolfe. He listened, then asked me to repeat 3 names. He doesn't take notes. He keeps them. "Good," he said. "Babel disguised as beneficence. They will have quarrels, concealed by their mission. You will go to see Miss Kent. She'll be with Kramer. Then you will go to police headquarters to see Miss Kent," he said, as if he'd just solved traffic. "Tell her this. I am now interested. If she withholds again, I will instruct you to withdraw. If she is candid, we may proceed to tether the thing. And if Kramer throws me down the steps?" "Use the elevator," Wolfe said. "And Archie, before you leave, have Fritz lock the front door. I prefer my disturber scheduled." I checked my watch, pocketed my notebook, and started for the hall. The house seemed to pause around us, listening for what would come through its doors next. On my way out, I saw Fritz hovering by the pantry, his face composed to its default serenity. I told him the inspector had taken a souvenir and that the next knock would be me coming back. "The house will wait," he said. Which was Fritz, for everything will be all right if we keep the soup hot. On the stoop, the air felt a shade sharper. I headed for 11th Street, thinking about a woman who managed her voice like a budget, a dead chairman who probably never imagined being interesting, and a foundation built like a wedding cake, pretty tears and unseen supports. If Wolfe was right, and he liked to be. It was time to see what kind of lie could push a man off the edge without touching him. Police headquarters at mid-afternoon is like a poorly tuned orchestra. Too many instruments, no conductor, and the percussion section determined to be heard above all else. I'd been there enough times to know the routine. Walk in like you belong, keep your hat straight, and remember that the guy who scowls the hardest is probably looking for someone else to blame. I asked the desk sergeant for Inspector Kramer, got a grunt, and was told to wait. 5 minutes later, Kramer's second-in-command, Pearlie Stebbins, lumbered into view. Pearlie has the kind of face that looks like it's been kneaded too long, but the brains to back up every line. He gave me the once-over like a man inspecting a suspicious package. "Goodwin," he said. "Wolfe send you to stir the pot?" "Not at all," I said. "I'm just here to borrow some sugar." He grunted. "You'll get your cavities. Come on." He led me upstairs to one of the smaller interview rooms. Through the window in the door, I could see Vivian Kent sitting at the table, hands clasped neatly, eyes forward. She looked less composed than before, though still doing her best imitation of a woman unshaken. The door opened, and she turned, relief flickering across her face for half a second before she smoothed it out again. "Miss Kent," I said, "I brought a message from Mr. Wolfe. He's developed an interest in your situation." Kramer was standing by the file cabinet, cigar hanging from his teeth like a declaration of war. "That's generous of him," he said. "Tell your boss this isn't a client interview, it's police business." "Then you won't mind if I talk to her after you're done?" He glared. "If there's anything left of her to talk to? Make it quick, Goodwin. I'm giving her a break, not a chat show." He stepped out, closing the door harder than was necessary. Pearlie remained planted outside, his silhouette blotting half the frosted glass. Vivian looked at me. "He thinks I killed Julian." "Well," I said, pulling up a chair, "statistically speaking, the woman who finds herself at police headquarters saying she didn't is off to a bad start." "I didn't," she said, firm but low. "He was alive when I left. We had a disagreement, but—" I raised an eyebrow. "A disagreement about your lie?" She hesitated. "In part." I waited. Silence has a way of making people think sound will save them. Finally, she exhaled. "Julian was my mentor. He gave me my first position at the foundation. 2 years ago, we ran a campaign, education outreach, grants for community programs. I discovered one of our partner organizations was falsifying expense reports. I told Julian. He said he'd handle it quietly. A week later, he told the board the matter was resolved. It wasn't." "You mean he covered it up?" She nodded once. "He thought exposure would hurt donor confidence. I let him. I told the auditors the discrepancy was clerical. That's the lie. And now somebody's decided to make that lie profitable," I said. "Yes. Someone knew. Or found out. I thought Julian was the target, but maybe I was." "Or both," I said. "That note could have been bait for either one of you." Her eyes went sharp, calculating. "You think he went to the conservatory?" "Not without telling someone," I said. "Wolfe thinks the blackmailer may have been inside your circle. He'd like your cooperation. Full cooperation." "I've already told you everything." "Not quite. You haven't named the organization that faked the reports." She swallowed. "The Eastbridge Youth Initiative." I made a note. "And who handled that account?" "Peter Lake," she said. "He's the grants manager. But he wouldn't. He's not that sort." I'd heard that tone before. It usually meant the speaker was either naive or in love. Maybe both. I stood. "All right, I'll pass this to Wolfe. He'll want to see any copies of the reports or correspondence you have. You'll cooperate?" "Yes." "Anything to stop this." Kramer reappeared in the doorway before I could answer. "Time's up, Goodwin. She's free for now. We've got statements to check." He looked at Vivian. "Don't go far, Miss Kent. And don't call Wolfe again unless you plan to bring cuffs for both of you." We left together, Pearlie trailing behind like a storm cloud. Out on the steps, the air smelled like newsprint and coffee. Vivian turned to me. "I'll send the documents this evening. Will that be all right?" "That'll be fine," I said. "Wolfe will want to see you again tomorrow. Just keep breathing until then." Her eyes flicked toward a passing cab. "Breathing, yes. That seems to be the challenge." She got in and disappeared down Center Street. I waited a beat, then headed for the nearest payphone and called Wolfe. Fritz answered, his voice steady as always. "He's in the plant rooms," Fritz said. "Tell him the lady sang, but only the first verse. I'll be back in an hour." When I got home, Wolfe was in his chair with a book on his lap and a look that meant his mind was 10 chapters ahead. I filled him in, the lie, the foundation, the Eastbridge Youth Initiative, and the grants manager with a conveniently clean conscience. He listened without comment, then asked, "Did she show fear?" "Yes, but not the right kind. More like someone who's rehearsed it." Then she is lying again, but not to protect herself. Possibly to shield another. Phooey. He tapped his fingers. "Archie, arrange to see Mr. Peter Lake this evening, if possible. You may tell him Miss Kent has retained me and that I am concerned about irregularities in the Foundation's financial history." "Think he'll talk?" "Of course not," Wolfe said. "But he will betray himself in the manner of his refusal. Observe him closely. A man suppressing guilt breathes differently." I got up, reached for my hat. "All right. Anything else?" "Yes. Take Saul with you. This business has already trespassed in my house once today. I prefer not to be surprised twice." That's Wolfe's version of saying the water's deeper than it looks. And from the sound of it, we'd just stepped off the pier. The sound of the shot tore through the fog like a rip in fabric, sudden, sharp, and final. It echoed off the water and the hulls of the docked freighters, then dissolved into the night's hush. For a second, everything stood still. Wolfe, rigid beside the car. The gulls startled into flight, and me, half a step ahead, trying to decide whether instinct or reason would move first. I ran. Wolfe balked my name once, low and firm, but I was already too far. The fog thickened as I crossed the planks, my shoes clattering against the damp wood. A figure stumbled near the edge of the pier. Lydia. She was kneeling beside the man, her hands on his coat, crying his name over and over, though it wasn't Rooker anymore. The face beneath her hands was different, younger. Whoever he was very dead. I crouched beside them. The gun, a small revolver, was on the ground between them, still warm. I kicked it away and pulled her back. "Mrs. Corbett," I said. "You're done running. Who is he?" She looked up at me through the fog, her face streaked with tears and something darker. Relief, maybe, or resignation. He said his name was Rook. Not Rooker, just Rook. He found me after Peter died. Said he'd been hired by the same people years ago. To watch Arthur, to make sure certain transactions stayed quiet. He said we both owed him. By paying up. She nodded slowly. I gave him what was left, all of it. He wanted to ship out tonight, but when I saw what he'd done to... Her voice cracked. He said he killed the man you found, to fake his own death. Said it was the only way to escape the police, but he didn't escape. He said I couldn't either. The details clicked into place like tumblers in a lock. The body in the alley. The limp. The fear. The handwriting on the note that had drawn us here. Rooker, or Rook, or whatever name he'd worn last, had been playing a game with his own shadow until the shadow finally turned on him. Behind us, I heard Wolfe's footsteps. Slow, deliberate, unmistakable. Fritz's car lights cut 2 weak paths through the fog. Wolfe stopped a few yards away and surveyed the scene. Is he dead? Stone, I said. 1 bullet. Chest. Wolfe drew a long breath, then exhaled through his nose. "Fitting," he murmured. The man who trafficked in death finally bought his own. He turned to Lydia, who had collapsed onto the pier, shaking. "Madame, you may be comforted, or not, by the fact that your conscience remains less bloodied than your fortune. This man's designs were his own undoing." She looked up at him helplessly. "He said you'd come. He said you always do." "I often arrive too late for satisfaction," Wolfe said quietly, "but never too late for understanding." Kramer's men showed up 15 minutes later, having been summoned by a call Wolfe placed from the car before we'd even left the brownstone. He'd predicted this, in his way. The inspector gave me a look that said, "I don't want to know how you keep ending up at the crime scenes before I do," but he didn't ask. He took the body, took Lydia, and took the credit, which suited everyone fine. By the time we got back to West 35th Street, it was past midnight. Fritz had left a light on in the kitchen and a bottle of cognac on the sideboard, which is his version of sympathy. Wolfe lowered himself into his chair, loosened his tie, and let out a sigh that sounded like it had been waiting since the Stone Age. "Rook," he said, a man who wished to rewrite his ending. The attempt was literary, if misguided. "He almost pulled it off," I said. "If he'd quit while ahead, he'd have been in Portugal by now." "Men of his kind never quit while ahead," Wolfe said. "Their appetite for deceit exceeds their skill at survival." He took a slow sip of cognac, then added, "Mrs. Corbett will not go to prison. Kramer will see that her cooperation absolves her of complicity. The law, at least, will sleep content. And you?" He looked at me, eyes half-lidded but alive with the faint gleam of completion. "I have no appetite for ghosts, Archie, but they insist on dining with me." That was as close as he ever came to sentiment. He reached for his book, found his place, and began reading as if the night had been nothing more than a mild interruption. I sat across from him, watching the lamplight catch the faint swirl of cigar smoke in the air. After a while, I said, "You know, I think she meant it when she said he told her you'd come." He didn't look up. Then the man was a fool twice over, once for underestimating me, and again for thinking it mattered. The clock ticked. Outside, the city was quiet again. Wolfe turned a page, his voice low but firm. "Archie, tomorrow remind Fritz we are to have cassoulet for dinner, and tell him to prepare enough for 2, should remorse decide to visit." That was Wolfe's way of closing the book, literally and otherwise. I nodded, went to switch off the light, and paused at the door. "Anything else, boss?" He didn't glance up. "Yes. Bolt the door." I did, and the brownstone sealed itself again, its peace restored, its inhabitants back in their natural order. Outside, New York went on breathing, indifferent as ever, while inside, Nero Wolfe sat beneath the lamp's golden glow, reading philosophy and pretending he didn't care that he'd just stared down death one more time without leaving his chair. And me? I poured a drink, toasted the silence, and thought about the widow, the hitman, and the strange choreography that had spun them together. Another case closed, another ghost catalogued. And somewhere deep in the house, Wolfe's voice drifted faintly through the still air, half to himself, half to me. "The appetite for deception, Archie, is the only hunger that never dies." I raised my glass to that, because he was right, as usual, and it was still my job to keep him fed. I called Saul Panzer around 7. He answered on the first ring, which meant he wasn't working another job or was waiting for one. Saul's voice is what you'd get if you could turn reliability into sound. I gave him the short version, the Sterling Foundation, Vivian Kent, and Wolfe's sudden case of curiosity, and told him to meet me in front of the Eastbridge Youth Initiative offices on East 46th. "Got it," he said. "You expecting company?" "Possibly. Or just a man with something to hide. Either way, bring your observational charm." "Archie," he said dryly, My charm is strictly optional, observations included. He hung up and I left the brownstone, giving Fritz the promise that I'd be back before Wolfe began growling for dinner. The Eastbridge building was one of those modern boxes that thinks glass and good lighting can hide a lack of substance. It housed non-profits, consultants, and at least 2 yoga studios, all pretending to change the world from the 5th floor up. The lobby smelled like disinfectant and ambition. Saul was waiting outside in his usual low-profile mode. Neat gray suit, hat with the brim tilted just enough to shade. Expression, but not intent. We exchanged nods, then went in. The directory pointed us to Suite 507, Eastbridge Youth Initiative. The door was locked. Through the frosted glass, I could see a faint glow. Someone was working late. I knocked. A moment later, the door opened a crack and a man peered out. 30s, thin, shirt sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. He looked like the kind of guy who's forgotten his last meal because he's been too busy worrying about the next grant. "Yes?" he said. "Peter Lake?" "That's right." I handed him one of Wolfe's cards. "I'm Archie Goodwin, assistant to Nero Wolfe. Miss Vivian Kent's retained us for consultation. I'd like a few minutes of your time." He frowned at the card like it might bite. "Consultation about what?" "Foundation business," I said pleasantly. "You'd rather have this conversation here, or would you prefer Kramer's office at Homicide?" That got his pulse visible at the neck. He opened the door wider and gestured us in. The office was modest but tidy, walls lined with framed mission statements and group photos of kids painting murals. The only sign of stress was a stack of folders on the desk, too many for one evening's work. He motioned us to sit, but I stayed standing. "Miss Kent mentioned you handled the Eastbridge grants," I began. "You know there's been talk of financial irregularities." His expression turned defensive faster than a cat hearing a vacuum cleaner. "Those reports were cleared 2 years ago, a clerical issue." "Right," I said. "Only now one of the people who cleared them is being blackmailed, and her boss dropped dead in his office this morning. So maybe the clerical issue wasn't so clerical." He swallowed. "That's ridiculous. I had nothing to do with—" "Look, the discrepancies were small. Some invoices, duplicate entries. I caught them myself." "And then what? Told Miss Kent?" "Yes. She told Julian. He said it would be fixed quietly." "Quietly," I repeated. "Meaning no audit trail, no public embarrassment, and no real cleanup." He hesitated. "It wasn't my decision." "Maybe not," I said. "But somebody's decision made sure the truth stayed buried. And someone's digging now. You've gotten any unusual messages lately?" He looked genuinely puzzled. "No, nothing. Anyone asking questions about the foundation?" He shook his head. "I mean, there was a donor who called last week, a Mrs. Vane, Clarice Vane, but she just wanted to confirm her endowment schedule." Saul, who had been quietly orbiting the room, spoke up. "You sure she didn't mention Ebert?" Lake blinked. "No, why would she?" "Because she's been on the board 10 years, Saul said mildly. "And she's one of the few who could make Ebert nervous." I turned to Lake. "You knew Ebert well." "I worked under him," he said. "He was particular, demanding." "Demands like what?" "Reports on every penny. But sometimes—" He stopped. "Sometimes what?" "Sometimes he wanted things redirected, to programs he thought more visible, or to satisfy donors who wanted their name on something quick." "Was Eastbridge one of those?" He rubbed his temple. "Possibly. Look, I don't know who's blackmailing Vivian, but if Ebert was involved, it's because he made enemies. Not me." "Enemies like who?" He spread his hands. "Half the board, maybe all of them. Miranda Cho hated him. She called him a relic. Dr. Quill was furious that Ebert blocked his research funding last quarter. And Lyle Barlow, well, Lyle was the reformer type. He thought Julian represented the old guard. They fought constantly." That gave me more than I'd expected. I glanced at Saul, who gave me the faintest nod. He'd seen something too. "All right," I said. "If you think of anything else, call the number on the card. Miss Kent's freedom might depend on it." He walked us to the door, but before opening it, he asked, "You really think Julian was murdered?" "I think people who lie often underestimate how much truth costs," I said. Outside, Saul and I paused on the sidewalk. The street was quieter now, the office lights thinning to a few holdouts. Saul stuck his hands in his pockets. "He's nervous," he said, "but not guilty nervous. He's scared for someone else." "I caught that too," I said. "My money's on Miss Kent." "Maybe, or someone she's protecting. The way he hesitated on those redirected funds, that smelled wrong." "Yeah," I said, "like the kind of wrong that ends up under Wolfe's magnifying glass." We split at the corner, Saul heading to check a lead at the conservatory, me toward home. It was nearly 9 when I got back to the brownstone. Fritz let me in, silent as a confessor. Wolfe was in his chair, beer within reach, eyes on the fire as if it were an argument he'd already won. I gave him the report, Lake, his nervous denial, the hint about Clarice Vane, the board squabbles. He listened, fingers interlaced, the faintest frown deepening at intervals. When I finished, he sat in silence for a full minute. Finally he said, "A lie sustained by charity. How convenient. They think morality diluted with philanthropy becomes virtue." "Pfui." He leaned back. "Archie, tell Saul to follow Mrs. Vane tomorrow, discreetly, and summon Miss Kent here at 10 in the morning. I will permit her to finish her confession." I asked, "And if she doesn't?" Wolfe looked at me over steepled fingers. "Then the truth will come without her consent. It always does, though rarely on schedule." I left him to his thoughts, which were the kind that made murderers nervous. Upstairs, I loosened my tie and wondered whether Vivian Kent knew just how white her lie still was, and how red it might soon turn. The next morning began with the sound of Wolfe dictating a letter to a honey supplier in Vermont, his tone precise, reverent, and only slightly less civil than when he talks to the IRS. I'd had breakfast with Fritz an hour earlier, and by the time the orchids were done receiving their daily homage, the doorbell announced the arrival of our contrite guest right on schedule. Vivian Kent entered with the look of someone who'd stopped trusting mirrors. She wore gray again, either a choice of prudence or mourning, and carried a folder pressed against her chest like a shield. Wolfe, having no respect for dramatics before coffee, motioned toward the red chair without a word. She sat. I took my usual place near the desk, pad ready, though I didn't need it. When people talk to Wolfe, they usually don't realize how much they're revealing until it's too late. "You have come," Wolfe said, "which suggests the need to continue your fabrication has diminished." Her jaw tightened. "You don't waste time on pleasantries, do you?" He lifted a brow. "I dislike deceit, Miss Kent. It is an inefficient use of language. Begin." She opened the folder, revealing correspondence, typed letters, financial statements, and what looked like donor memos. "I've brought copies of everything related to Eastbridge, and—" She hesitated, then added quietly, "a letter Julian wrote me 2 weeks ago." I leaned in as she handed it over. Wolfe read in silence. The letter was brief but weighted. Ebert had written that the past may soon resurface, that he trusted her discretion, and that, if the matter became public, their positions would both be untenable. "His death," Wolfe said, "renders the final line prophetic. Were you romantically involved?" She looked startled. "No, absolutely not. Julian was married." "Married men have been known to possess imaginations," Wolfe said dryly. "However, your tone persuades me. Continue." Vivian steadied herself. "He meant the Eastbridge falsifications. Someone had been revisiting the old ledgers. I don't know who. Last Friday I found one of the files missing from the archive room, just gone. I told Julian. He said he'd check the next morning. Then the note came. Remind me, Wolfe said, what time you saw Mr. Ebert on the day of his death. 11:30. I went to his office. He was tense, distracted. Said he'd been warned that something was coming, a scandal, maybe a leak. I tried to tell him I'd handle it, but he said it was too late. Then he asked me to leave. Did he specify who warned him? No. Did he seem afraid? Her eyes flickered. Yes, and angry, but mostly tired, like a man cornered by something he couldn't prove. Wolfe tapped a finger against the desk. And afterward, you came here. Yes, I thought if anyone could find the truth, it would be you. He grunted, which in Wolfe's vocabulary meant she wasn't entirely wrong. This missing file, what precisely did it contain? Expense documentation for the Eastbridge grant's final quarter. Receipts, approval forms, correspondence. It would show that the false reports were replaced with clean ones. The originals were destroyed, or so I thought. Destroyed, Wolfe repeated, the word tasting sour. And yet they rise again, as do all things poorly buried. She looked at him, anxious. Do you think the file was stolen from the Foundation? Not stolen, Wolfe said. Exhumed. Someone who knew its history removed it. That person, Miss Kent, may also have ended Mr. Ebert's career and his life. Her hands tightened around the folder. Then you'll help me. I'm helping you, he said, but not as you expect. My duty is to truth, not to client's comfort. He turned to me. Archie, call Saul. Tell him to report immediately. I went to the phone and got Saul within minutes. He arrived half an hour later, his expression telling me he'd had a night richer in information than in sleep. Morning, he said. Mrs. Clarice Vane had herself a busy evening. Wolfe gestured for detail. Saul flipped open his notebook. She left her townhouse at 8, took a cab to a private dining club on Park. Met there with Lyle Barlow, your reformer. They stayed an hour. Then she went uptown, stopped at a safety deposit branch on Madison for 10 minutes, and came home. No detours, no tale. Vivian stiffened. Lyle? That doesn't make sense. They've despised each other for years. On the contrary, Wolfe said, it makes exquisite sense. Antagonism is a fine disguise for alliance. Mr. Barlow, as executive director, would have every reason to sanitize the Foundation's image. Mrs. Vane, with her social reach, would profit from preserving its luster. If Eastbridge's fraud came to light, both would lose currency, he professionally, she socially. Vivian's color drained. You think they were blackmailing Julian? Perhaps, Wolfe murmured. Or perhaps they intended a quieter arrangement, one that failed when Ebert resisted. Saul said, if that's true, the meeting last night might have been a damage control session. Possibly. We will know soon. Wolfe leaned back. Miss Kent, you will contact Mr. Barlow. Tell him you have recovered the missing file and must discuss it privately. Propose this evening, 6 o'clock, at your office. Her eyes widened. You want me to bait him? Bait, Wolfe said, is the instrument by which fish reveal themselves. You need only hold the line. Archie and Mr. Panzer will observe discreetly. Should Barlow attempt retrieval, verbal or physical, we will have confirmation. I said, and what do I do when he takes the hook? Document everything, Wolfe said. Words, gestures, hesitations. Miss Kent, if he presses. You for the file. Tell him you've placed it elsewhere for safety. That will compel either negotiation or panic. Both are eloquent. She looked uncertain, but nodded. All right, I'll do it. Good. Fritz will show you out. When she left, Wolfe exhaled heavily and reached for his beer. Archie, he said, I dislike involving women in stratagems. It complicates the arithmetic, yet necessity trumps taste. Watch her closely. Meaning you don't trust her? Meaning, he said, she may not trust herself. Conscience makes erratic partners. Saul pocketed his notebook. "You think Barlow's our man?" "I think," Wolfe said slowly, "that the truth is a coalition. The Foundation's benevolence is a cloak stitched by many hands. We shall see who tugs at the thread first." He closed his eyes. The conversation dismissed. Saul and I exchanged a look. The job had officially shifted from reconnaissance to provocation. Outside, the autumn light was sharp enough to make the city honest for 5 minutes at a time. I thought of Vivian Kent rehearsing courage for her evening act, and of Wolfe, immovable as ever, setting his trap from the comfort of an armchair. If the bait held, someone was going to twitch before sunset, and I planned to be close enough to see whose conscience broke the surface first. By 5 that evening, Saul and I were in position outside the Sterling Foundation building, parked in a sedan that had seen better owners. Wolfe doesn't believe in coincidences, and he doesn't believe in waiting rooms either. So we were the field division, tasked with observation and the occasional improvisation. Vivian Kent had called Barlow an hour earlier, following Wolfe's script almost word for word. The man had agreed to meet her in her office at 6, with the enthusiasm of someone who suspects the clock is running out. Saul was behind the wheel, silent, his eyes flicking between the front entrance and the upper windows reflected in the opposite building. The Foundation's offices took up 2 floors, though you'd never know which floor the money lived on and which did the work. At 6 sharp, Lyle Barlow appeared. He was easy to spot, lean, deliberate, his coat too expensive for a non-profit salary. He paused outside, glanced up at the building once, then went in. I checked my watch. "Right on time," I said. Saul gave a small grunt. He's the kind who runs his life like a ledger. Even his sins balance. Let's hope tonight tips the scale. We waited. 15 minutes passed. The lobby lights changed tone as the evening crew dimmed the main hall. Then, movement, a shadow near the 5th floor window. Pacing. Barlow's silhouette, nervous, hand gestures visible even through the glass. Vivian's form was still, deliberate. She was holding. Wolfe's training, even indirect, does wonders for the posture of an amateur in a trap. At 6:30, Barlow stepped back from the window and vanished deeper into the office. Saul reached for the door handle. "Give him 5 more," I said. "If he's going to reach for something stupid, we might as well let him show us where he keeps it." 5 minutes later, the office lights went off. A second's pause, then one desk lamp flicked back on. Movement again. 2 shapes. Vivian near the door, Barlow closer to the window, arm raised. "That's it," I said. "Let's move." We took the stairs 2 at a time. Saul, being Saul, moved like sound, had gone on strike. I trailed behind, less poetic but efficient. When we reached the 5th floor, the hallway was empty except for the distant hum of the cleaning staff. Vivian's office was at the end, glass door, name etched cleanly. I pushed it open just as Barlow was tucking a brown envelope into his coat pocket. Vivian turned, startled but not afraid. Barlow froze, color draining from his face. "Who the hell are you?" "Friends of the house," I said, stepping inside. Saul followed, closing the door with a quiet click that said we weren't leaving early. "We'll call this an unannounced audit." Vivian moved aside, visibly shaking but keeping her voice steady. "He demanded the file," she said. "He said it was dangerous in my hands." Barlow's composure cracked, then reassembled itself. "Miss Kent has misunderstood. I came only to secure Foundation property. She's under strain. Julian's death has everyone uneasy." "Sure," I said. "I get uneasy too when people die inconveniently." I nodded toward his coat. "You mind showing us what you've got there?" He hesitated. Saul took one small step forward, and that was enough. Barlow drew out the envelope and slapped it on the desk. "Satisfied?" I opened it. Inside were photocopies of the Eastbridge receipts, originals, not replacements. There were signatures on them, one of which belonged to Vivian, and another to Julian Ebert. A third, faintly stamped, bore the initials CV. Clarice Vane, I said quietly. So the donor didn't just fund the fraud, she signed off on it. Barlow's jaw tightened. She didn't know what she was signing. Julian handled the financial details. I only tried to keep the foundation intact. By blackmailing your boss. By preventing collapse, he snapped. Ebert was going to destroy everything. He'd become erratic, paranoid. He said he'd confess to the board and bring us all down with him. I told Clarice we had to act, warn him off, not harm him. That note was her idea. Vivian stared at him, pale. You're saying she wrote the blackmail letter? Yes, he said bitterly. Typed it herself. She thought fear would keep him quiet, but he wouldn't be managed. He called me that morning, said he was going to the police. Except he didn't make it, I said. Barlow's voice broke into a whisper. No, he didn't. Saul and I exchanged a look. The story had the ring of truth, too rough around the edges to be rehearsed. I asked, where were you when he died? At a meeting with donors. Check with them, I swear it. Vivian folded her arms. And the file? I came to destroy it before Clarice panicked and made things worse. She already has, I said. You'd better hope that envelope is the worst of it. Saul stepped forward, taking the copies. Archie, he said, we should take this to Wolfe. Barlow raised a hand. You can't. This will ruin us. Mr. Barlow, I said, if you're worried about ruin, you should have picked another trade. Philanthropy's a fine cover for crooks, but it doesn't age well. We left him sitting behind Vivian's desk, face in his hands, the kind of man who'd finally realized his moral bookkeeping didn't balance anymore. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened as I laid it out. Saul stood beside the desk, holding the envelope like it was mildly radioactive. Wolfe didn't touch it. He just looked at it. So, he said finally, Mrs. Vane pens the note, Mr. Barlow enforces discretion, and Mr. Ebert rebels. That explains motive, method, and means, but not death. Barlow says he didn't do it, I said. Claims an alibi. Wolfe nodded faintly. He may have one. Mrs. Vane, however, does not. Nor does she strike me as a woman to leave loose ends. He reached for the bell pull. Fritz appeared, silent as breath. Beer, Wolfe said, and call Inspector Kramer. Tell him we have another corpse in the making. When Fritz left, Wolfe leaned back, eyes half closed. Archie, tomorrow morning, Mrs. Vane will visit us. She will believe she comes to manage appearances. Instead, she will confront exposure. I expect her composure to falter, but not collapse. Be prepared to press where she hesitates. A liar, when cornered, always remembers too much or too little. I said, and when she remembers just enough? Then, Wolfe murmured, we will know who turned a white lie red. The fire popped, a sharp punctuation in the quiet room. Outside, the city kept its usual pace of indifference, but inside the brownstone, the air had that charged stillness before Wolfe moved from deduction to revelation. The stage set, the players chosen, and the final act waiting for its cue. Mrs. Clarice Vane arrived the next morning dressed for absolution. She wore a black suit trimmed in pearl buttons and a hat that would have made a bishop hesitate before blessing it. Fritz ushered her into the office, and she took in the room the way a connoisseur examines a piece of art. Assessing, not admiring. When she saw Wolfe in his chair, she smiled like someone extending charity to the undeserving. Mr. Wolfe, she said, I appreciate your discretion in requesting this meeting. Wolfe inclined his head, which for him was practically curtsying. You misunderstand, madam. I do not request, I summon. Sit. She sat, folding her gloves carefully on her lap. Then let us not waste time. I assume this concerns the unfortunate matter of Mr. Ebert's death. Inspector Kramer's men have been most intrusive. They have that talent, Wolfe said. I have no desire to duplicate their labor. My concern is with a different species of intrusion, moral rather than physical. You knew Julian Ebert well. As one does a colleague, she said smoothly. We shared a respect for the Foundation's mission. His loss is regrettable, though the organization must endure. I caught Wolfe's slight frown, the kind that meant her phrasing had hit a sour note. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. Indeed, endurance seems to be your specialty. You are the board's longest-serving member. That must grant you influence over the Foundation's finances. She tilted her head. Influence, Mr. Wolfe, is such an unfashionable word. I prefer stewardship. And yet your stewardship included authorizing funds for the Eastbridge Youth Initiative. Her eyes narrowed, though her tone stayed calm. Naturally, it was one of our finest programs. Was it? Wolfe asked mildly. The financial reports suggest otherwise. You signed documents later found to be falsified. For the first time, she hesitated. If there were errors, they were clerical. I'm not an accountant. Nor, I imagine, are you a typist, Wolfe said. Yet the letter sent to Miss Kent, a crude attempt at extortion, was composed on your typewriter. We have the paper and the carbon imprint. That wasn't strictly true. Saul hadn't tested it yet, but Wolfe's words landed with the force of certainty. Mrs. Vane's composure cracked just enough to show the scaffolding beneath. That's absurd, she said sharply. Why would I threaten Vivian? She's a valued employee. Because, Wolfe said, Mr. Ebert was no longer controllable. You and Mr. Barlow sought to prevent him from confessing the fraud. You believed fear might silence him. You were mistaken. Her lips thinned. You have no proof of such nonsense. Proof is Kramer's preoccupation. I deal in logic. You and Barlow conspired to contain a scandal. Ebert's integrity became an obstacle. You sent a threat. He responded with defiance. Within hours, he was dead. She rose, indignation perfectly arranged. I will not sit here and be accused. Wolfe didn't move, but his voice cut through the air. Sit down, madam. The authority in that tone would have made a senator reconsider his vote. She sat, color rising high on her cheeks. Wolfe continued, softer now. You are intelligent. You would not risk murder yourself, but you might rely on a subordinate who misjudged your intentions, someone like Mr. Barlow, perhaps. She faltered. Lyle wouldn't. He's loyal. To whom? Wolfe asked. The Foundation? You? Himself? Her silence was a confession with punctuation. I said, we have the envelope he tried to destroy, Mrs. Vane. Your initials appear on every page. You can keep denying, but if Wolfe turns that over to Kramer, you'll spend the next year explaining clerical errors under oath. She turned to me, eyes bright with sudden fear. He wasn't supposed to die. We only meant to frighten him. Julian was stubborn. He said if we didn't tell the board, he would. Lyle thought if he confronted him, he could reason with him. When he called me afterward, he sounded shaken. Wolfe's eyelids lowered. What did he say? That it was an accident, she whispered. He went to Ebert's office, tried to persuade him to hand over the files. They argued. Julian reached for the phone and Lyle shoved him back. He fell, hit his head on the corner of the desk. Lyle panicked. He called me. I told him to leave, to lock the door behind him and say nothing. It was already too late. Silence filled the room. Even the city outside seemed to pause to hear it. Wolfe finally spoke. You realize, of course, that you are confessing to accessory after the fact. Yes, she said, but I didn't kill him. Lyle will. He'll tell you. I have no interest in his version, Wolfe said. The truth is complete without it. He looked at me. Archie, telephone Inspector Kramer. Inform him that his murderer awaits collection. I started for the phone, but Mrs. Vane rose quickly. Please, she said. Let me speak to him first. I'll go willingly. I only wanted to preserve the Foundation's reputation. Julian's death, none of this was supposed to happen. That, Wolfe said, is the epitaph of every fool who confuses expedience with virtue. She gathered her gloves, hands trembling now. You're a cruel man, Mr. Wolfe. I am indifferent, he replied. Cruelty requires passion. Fritz entered as she left, murmuring that Inspector Kramer was on his way. Wolfe nodded without looking at him. When she was gone, I said, You knew she'd crack before she even walked in. Wolfe sighed, eyes half closed. She wore guilt like perfume. All I had to do was breathe. Barlow's going to confirm it, you know, I said. He'll take the fall, and she'll testify she never meant harm. Maybe even walk. Perhaps, Wolfe said, but the moral arithmetic remains. The lie she called white has left a man dead. It will stain her longer than any sentence. He gestured toward the beer Fritz had brought. Archie, pour. I have no appetite for hypocrisy, but I find beer curiously cleansing. I poured. The phone rang just as I set the glass down. It was Kramer, gruff and weary, saying he was on his way with his men. When I hung up, Wolfe was already leaning back, eyes closed, serenity restored. Archie, he murmured, remind me to instruct Fritz to serve trout tonight. It is a virtuous fish, silent, clean, and incapable of deceit. I said, sure, but next time, maybe we pick a client who lies less colorfully. He opened one eye. Color is the least of a lie's offenses. It is its consequence that makes it mortal. I didn't answer. Outside, the sirens were growing closer, and the brownstone waited, as it always did, to swallow chaos and return to calm. Kramer arrived 20 minutes later, a damp cigar clamped in his teeth and an expression that could have soured milk at 20 paces. He came in without waiting for Fritz to announce him, trailed by Pearlie Stebbins, who carried the kind of satisfaction men reserve for overdue paybacks. Mrs. Vane was already sitting stiffly in the red chair, hands folded, eyes on the carpet. Wolfe hadn't moved an inch since she'd confessed, and you could have mistaken him for a monument to self-control. All right, Wolfe, Kramer said, slapping his hat on the desk like a warrant. You called, so make it good. What's the charge this time? Murder, conspiracy, or just garden variety fraud? Wolfe opened his eyes with visible reluctance. Murder by misadventure, abetted by stupidity, he said. I trust that's covered under your code. Don't start with your dictionary tricks, Kramer growled. Who's the suspect? Wolfe nodded toward Mrs. Vane. She will inform you. Her assistant, Lyle Barlow, may be found at his office. I suggest you send someone before remorse inspires him to creativity. Kramer turned on Mrs. Vane. You ready to talk? She lifted her head slowly, the exhaustion settling in her features like dust. I've already told Mr. Wolfe Julian's death was an accident. Lyle went there to reason with him, and it went wrong. I only wanted to keep the Foundation intact. Pearlie muttered something about rich folks and their causes, but Kramer waved him silent. You realize obstruction's still a crime, lady? I realize, she said quietly. Kramer sighed and took out his notebook. All right, you'll come down to the office and put it in writing. He looked at Wolfe. You sure about this? As sure as one can be when dealing with moral cowards, Wolfe said. That did it. Kramer's temper boiled up like an overworked kettle. One of these days I'll haul you in just to see if you talk so high and mighty from a holding cell. Inspector, Wolfe said mildly. Were that to happen, the walls themselves would protest. Kramer scowled, snapped his notebook shut, and jerked his head toward the door. Come on, Mrs. Vane. She stood, gathered her gloves, and paused at the threshold. For what it's worth, Mr. Wolfe, she said, Julian Ebert wasn't blameless. He built the lie first. We only tried to live inside it. Madam, Wolfe replied, when one builds a house of deceit, one must not complain when the roof falls. She went out without another word. Kramer followed, muttering something about philosophers in slippers, and the front door shut hard enough to rattle the orchids upstairs. For a while, the room was still. Wolfe sat unmoving, eyes closed, lips pressed together in a line that could have been satisfaction or disgust. I waited. When Wolfe's thinking, you don't rush him. The air in the office does enough pacing for both of you. Finally, he said, "Archie, have you ever observed how the pursuit of virtue, when paired with vanity, breeds calamity?" "I've observed it usually lands us another billable hour," I said. "You want me to add that to the invoice?" He ignored that. These people, Vane, Barlow, Ebert, believed themselves custodians of moral improvement. Yet they built their empire on pretense. When confronted with failure, they lied to preserve illusion, a predictable symmetry. "Sure," I said, "except that symmetry leaves one dead, one ruined, and one trying to save her soul through paperwork." "Miss Kent," Wolfe murmured. "Yes. She is, I presume, relieved?" "She will be," I said. "I called her while you were lecturing Kramer. She's at police headquarters now, giving her statement. Says she'll stop by tomorrow to thank you personally." Wolfe groaned. "I do not require gratitude, Archie. It complicates digestion." "Yeah, but she insists. And between you and me, she doesn't sound much like a woman finished with conscience cleaning." Wolfe opened one eye. "Then she may stay away. Confession is tedious when performed twice." I grinned. "You're just mad she made you work before lunch." He snorted, a sound that meant the conversation was over. Fritz entered, silent and efficient, to clear away the untouched beer glass. Dinner aromas had begun to drift in from the kitchen, roast duck by the smell of it, and something involving truffles that probably cost more than my car's last repair. When Wolfe finally rose, slowly as if moving disturbed his principles, he said, "Archie, ensure the front door remains locked this evening. I will tolerate no further interruptions." "You expect trouble?" "I expect peace," he said, "and that is infinitely rarer." He disappeared toward the dining room. I tidied the desk, thinking about the pieces left behind. A dead man who'd meant to confess, a reformer whose good intentions had slipped on a polished floor, and a woman who'd believed a white lie could stay clean if wrapped in charity. The city outside was settling into its usual hum, indifferent as ever to the moral wreckage behind closed doors. Half an hour later, the phone rang. Fritz answered, then called for me. "Miss Kent," he said. Her voice was steady, but the edge was gone. "I wanted to tell you, it's done. Kramer believes me. They've charged Barlow. Mrs. Vane's making a statement. I suppose it's justice." "That's what they call it," I said. "How's it feel?" "Like truth," she said after a pause. "Ugly, but lighter." "Wolfe will be gratified," I said, though he'd deny it on principle. She laughed softly. "Tell him thank you for everything." When I hung up, Wolfe was back in the doorway, a napkin draped like a banner of surrender. "Miss Kent," she says thank you. He nodded once, ponderously. "Then she is a rarity. Most who invoke gratitude have learned nothing." He studied the fire a moment longer, then added, almost to himself, "The lie began to spare another. It ended by destroying them all. Thus, as ever, self-deception proves the most fatal indulgence." I said, "You could have put that on the invoice, too." He gave me a sidelong look. "Archie, there are truths even money cannot sweeten." I let that one sit. Outside, the sirens had faded, and the city hummed back to its regular rhythm. Inside, the brownstone had already begun to breathe again, the familiar calm settling like dust on polished wood. The storm had passed, leaving behind only the quiet, and Wolfe, restored to his chair, was content to let silence reclaim its territory. He reached for his beer and raised it slightly, as if to no one in particular. "To truth," he said, "which, like beer, is best uncolored. I couldn't argue with that. Some days, even Wolfe's philosophy tastes almost human. By the time morning came around again, the brownstone had reclaimed its usual order, the kind that made you think the walls themselves would protest if anything as messy as human emotion tried to linger. Wolfe was already in the plant rooms when I came down, tending to his orchids like they were diplomats, requiring delicate persuasion. The phone hadn't rung, which meant either Kramer had gone temporarily sane or Wolfe's prediction of peace had, against all odds, materialized. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when Fritz appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "Miss Kent is here." I glanced at my watch. 9:30. She was early, which for a woman who'd just spent the night watching her world disintegrate was either admirable or suspicious. "Send her in," I said. Vivian Kent entered quietly, without the tension she'd carried before. She looked like someone who'd survived a storm but hadn't yet decided whether to rebuild. Her eyes had the steadiness of exhaustion. She held a small envelope, which she set carefully on Wolfe's desk, though he wasn't there to see it. "I brought this for him," she said. "It's the Foundation's final payment. I wanted to deliver it in person." "Kind of you," I said. "He'll appreciate it, assuming appreciation doesn't violate one of his codes." She smiled faintly. "I suppose you both think I'm just relieved it's over." "Are you?" "I'm not sure," she said, looking toward Wolfe's empty chair. "Julian's dead. Clarice and Lyle will spend years in court, and the Foundation may never recover. I told myself that saving it was worth one small lie. I keep wondering when I started believing that." "Probably the same day everyone else at that table did," I said. "Wolfe calls it moral arithmetic. The problem is, no one checks their math until the sum turns red." She looked at me, considering that, then nodded. "He said something similar yesterday at headquarters, about self-deception being fatal." "Yeah," I said. "He's good at post-mortems, physical or philosophical." Before she could reply, the familiar heavy tread came from the hall. Wolfe entered, wiping his hands with the meticulousness of a surgeon, his expression unreadable. "Miss Kent," he said, as if she were both expected and inconvenient, "you have concluded your affairs with Inspector Kramer." "Yes. He's satisfied that I had no part in the cover-up beyond the initial lie. They've charged Mr. Barlow with manslaughter, and Mrs. Vane will face accessory charges." Wolfe grunted, lowering himself into his chair. "Kramer's satisfactions are fleeting, but that will suffice." She gestured toward the envelope. "I came to settle my account, and to thank you. I know gratitude is an unwelcome guest here, but I brought it anyway." He regarded the envelope as if it might explode. "Your payment was neither requested nor required. You may leave it if it eases your conscience." "It doesn't," she said softly. "But it's all I can offer." There was a pause, the kind Wolfe uses like a scalpel. Finally, he said, "Miss Kent, you are an intelligent woman. Intelligence is wasted when used for concealment. What will you do now?" "I've resigned from the Foundation. There's nothing left to repair." "Good," he said. "Begin again elsewhere, but with less zeal for protection. Lies told for noble purpose rot no slower than any other." That hit her harder than she wanted to show. She straightened, nodded once, and managed a small, genuine smile. "You'd make a terrible minister, Mr. Wolfe." "On the contrary," he said. "I preach constantly, but only to one parishioner, myself." I stood and escorted her to the door. Outside on the stoop, she paused. The wind tugged at her hair. "You think he believes any of what he says?" "Oh, he believes it," I said. "He just finds the human race an unreliable congregation." She gave a small laugh, almost free of bitterness. "Then tell him this. For once, he converted someone." She went down the steps and into the cab, waiting at the curb. When I returned to the office, Wolfe was sitting motionless, the envelope still unopened in front of him. "You're not going to cash it?" I asked. He looked at me, eyes half-lidded. "I may. Money, unlike remorse, serves a function." "Sure," I said, "though you'd be hard-pressed to buy absolution with it." He gave me a look that would have wilted a stronger man. "Archie, spare me your theology. You have other work." I sat back at my desk, pretending to organize notes while watching him. After a while, he reached for his beer. The first sip always made his expression soften slightly, as if even he had to concede that life occasionally deserved tolerance. "Archie," he said, "did you notice Miss Kent's hands?" "Only in a professional capacity." "They were unsteady but not tremulous," he said, "a sign of internal struggle without collapse. She will recover." "I'll add her to the list of your successful rehabilitations," I said. "Phooey. I'm not a healer, merely an observer. Human frailty fascinates me, but I do not mend it." "You did this time," I said. Or at least kept it from spreading." He didn't answer. The office was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Outside, a truck rumbled past, shaking a few notes loose from Fritz's piano upstairs. Finally, Wolfe said, "The deception began as trivial, a single false statement meant to preserve decorum. Yet it grew, it gathered allies, corrupted intention. The pattern repeats endlessly." "Not endlessly," I said. "Sometimes someone like you shows up and calls it what it is." He allowed himself a brief glance in my direction. "Then perhaps I am the penalty for dishonesty, a necessary nuisance." "Yeah," I said, grinning, "but a well-paid one." That earned me a faint twitch of his mouth, which in Wolfen terms borders on affection. He reached for another sip of beer and set it down with finality. "Enough," he said. "Fritz will serve lunch shortly. Trout, I believe. Still keeping with your theme of virtuous fish." "Indeed," he murmured. "A creature that survives by silence deserves respect." I leaned back, letting the day settle. The storm had passed, leaving Wolfe content, the house at ease, and me with the satisfying hum that follows a case tied off clean. Outside, the city was already busy inventing new lies. But for the moment, within those walls, truth had the floor, and, like Wolfe's beer, it was best served cold. Dinner that evening was as civilized as a peace treaty and almost as quiet. Fritz outdid himself, poached trout with butter and herbs, creamed spinach that could have been served at the court of a czar, and a custard that nearly made me forget the past week's worth of corpses, confessions, and philosophical sermons. Wolfe said little, which suited the occasion. When he eats well, conversation is an intrusion. After dessert, we moved to the office, that sacred ground where morality and logic have to share armchairs. Wolfe settled into his own, with the air of a monarch resuming a throne. The fire was low, and the day had softened into that hour when New York sounds half asleep. Horns distant, footsteps softened by the promise of night. I took my usual chair. Notebook. Closed. Case closed. Mind restless. "Archie," he said finally, breaking the kind of silence that needs pruning shears. "The newspapers will reduce this to scandal and folly. They will print that the Sterling Foundation was undone by greed, incompetence, and a regrettable accident. But what truly destroyed them was presumption." "Meaning," I said, "that they thought they could cheat truth and get away with it." He gave me a look. "Meaning they thought truth was theirs to negotiate. That is the prevailing human delusion." I grinned. "You could write a sermon on that if you didn't mind the collection plate." He snorted softly. "I'm not in the business of saving souls. I merely catalogue their decay." I let that sit, watching the flames reflect on the brass inlays of his desk. "Vivian Kent seems determined to rebuild herself," I said. "She called while you were working on your second trout." She's accepted a position with an education non-profit uptown. Says she wants to work quietly. No boards, no publicity. Ah, Wolfe said. The penitent seeks smaller altars. She sounded sincere. She may well be. The consciousness of guilt can be a fine tutor, provided it does not turn self-pity into scholarship. That's as close as you'll get to wishing her luck, I said. I do not deal in luck, he said, closing his eyes. It has the odor of gambling. Fair enough, I said. But you have to admit the case wrapped itself neatly. No missing suspects, no last-minute alibis, no hysterical widows flinging themselves at your feet. Just a clean confession, a tidy motive, and a few broken reputations. Wolfe's eyes opened halfway. You mistake symmetry for satisfaction. I abhor disorder, yes, but the illusion of order built upon corruption is equally distasteful. This affair was not tidy, Archie. It was sordid. A man died not from malice, but from cowardice disguised as virtue. That is the most common crime of all. Maybe, I said, but it still beats murder for money. At least they told themselves they were doing it for a good cause. That is precisely the danger, he said sharply. The thief who steals for greed admits his nature. The liar who sins for righteousness believes himself exempt from consequence. I leaned back. So what do you call yourself? The consequence? He took a deliberate sip of beer before answering. The observer. I illuminate the pattern and allow others to trip over it. It is not justice I serve, Archie. Merely truth, and even that imperfectly. You're modest tonight, I said. Should I be worried? He ignored that. Kramer will have his victory. The district attorney will file his charges. Society will call it closure. Yet nothing is closed. Miss Kent will spend her years atoning for a lie she told to preserve a man unworthy of it. Mrs. Vane will convince herself she acted from necessity, and Barlow will wake each morning to the sound of his own conscience rattling like a chain. The punishment of fools, Archie, is that they must live with what they are. You forgot yourself in that list, I said. He smiled faintly, just a crease at the corner of his mouth. I am exempt. I know what I am. Sure, I said. A genius with a waistline problem. That earned me a low rumble that might have been amusement. He reached for another beer, the fourth of the evening, and the gesture was so routine it felt like punctuation. Archie, he said, you are insufferable. I try, I said. The clock on the mantel chimed 9. Fritz appeared with coffee on a tray, his expression that of a man presiding over the restoration of peace. He served us both and withdrew with his customary ghost-like efficiency. Wolfe inhaled the steam rising from his cup and sighed, a long sound that carried both satisfaction and fatigue. The brown stone, he said quietly, remains inviolate. It is the one order I can still maintain in a world that breeds confusion faster than orchids bloom. Until the next client knocks, I said. Pfui, he said, eyes closed again. If civilization had any sense, it would outlaw clients. I laughed. And deprive you of your favorite form of exercise. You'd be bored stiff without hypocrisy to analyze. Boredom, he said, is preferable to idiocy. I let him have the last word, which in our partnership is rarer than a polite cab driver. He sat there, motionless, a mountain of calm intellect, while outside the city's heartbeat thudded against the glass. The fire sank lower, throwing soft gold over the rows of books and the gleam of his desk globe. It felt like the brownstone itself was breathing again, steady, content, ready for another siege when the world decided to intrude. I stood, stretched, and said, Well, boss, I'm off duty unless you've got another crusade lined up. No crusades, he murmured. Merely the pursuit of dinner and dignity. You already had dinner. Then I pursue dignity, he said, and closed his eyes. I left him to it. Upstairs, I could hear Fritz clearing the dining room, the faint clatter of china, a lullaby of normalcy. I paused at the bottom of the stairs and looked back once. Wolfe sat unmoving, framed by the firelight, a monument to reason surrounded by a city addicted to delusion. He'd call it the end of another case. I called it a reminder that truth, however ugly, always makes itself at home here, between his chair and my desk, waiting for the next knock on the door. And when it came, and it always did, Wolfe would sigh, curse humanity, and accept. Because underneath the orchids and the oratory, he loved the hunt too much to let the world lie in peace. As for me, I'd be right there, pen in hand, ready to write it all down again. The city never stops lying, and Nero Wolfe never stops listening. And somehow, between the two of us, we keep the balance. Him with logic, me with motion, and both of us with just enough patience to wait for the next white lie to darken our doorstep.